The laughter started before she reached the firing line. Sergeant Major Vickers heard it. A low murmur moving through the assembled snipers, the way wind moves through dry grass. And he chose not to address it. He had seen this before. New faces always drew attention. Female faces drew more. Female faces attached to civilian transfer credentials drew the kind of attention that could curdle a unit from the inside. And so he filed the sound away and kept walking. The woman standing at position 7 did not react to the laughter at all. That was the first thing Vickers noticed about her. Not the way she stood, though she stood correctly, weight distributed, shoulders level without being rigid, but the fact that she appeared genuinely unaware that 31 members of the Joint Task Force 2 long-range training cadre had just decided, collectively and without discussion, that she did not belong here. Her name was Brennan, Specialist Audra Brennan on paper. The transfer documentation from DRDC, the Defense Research and Development Canada facility outside Ottawa, described her role as Analytical Support Specialist, which was the kind of deliberately ambiguous phrasing that military bureaucracy produced when it wasn't sure how to categorize something. Vickers had read the file 3 times. He still wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. What the file said: Brennan had spent 6 years embedded with a ballistics modeling team, developing trajectory correction algorithms for long-range precision fire under non-standard atmospheric conditions. She held a graduate degree in applied mathematics from the University of Waterloo. She had logged 1,100 hours in controlled range environments. She had never deployed. What the file did not say, what files of this particular kind never said, was why she was here now, at CFB Petawawa, assigned to an active training rotation with operators who had each accumulated between 4 and 9 combat deployments, and who regarded the concept of analytical support with the particular wariness that professionals reserve for things they do not understand and do not trust. Vickers stopped behind her. Brennan. She turned. Mid-30s, he estimated. Dark hair pulled back. Eyes that moved to his face and stayed there without the flicker of anxiety he'd half expected. Sir, you've read the rotation schedule. Yes, sir. This morning's exercise. Do you know what you're looking at? She glanced down the range. 800 meters to the primary target. Wind flag at the 400-meter mark, showing a 12-kilometer crosswind from the northwest, gusting irregularly. Temperature 14 degrees and dropping. A standard qualification chute for experienced operators, and a genuinely difficult one. I do, she said. Vickers waited to see if she would add anything. She didn't. He left her there and walked to the observation post, where Master Corporal Wieland was already waiting, with a clipboard and an expression that communicated, without any words whatsoever, exactly what he thought of the morning's arrangements. Sir, Wieland said with respect, save it. She's never run a live rotation. I'm aware. The cadre's been watching her since she arrived. If she drops the ball on this, then she drops the ball. Vickers took the clipboard. And we move on. Wieland said nothing further, but the silence had a shape to it. It was the shape of a man who believed that certain problems could be anticipated and avoided, and that placing an untested specialist in the middle of a Joint Task Force qualifications exercise was not the kind of decision that made anticipation possible. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he also didn't have access to the portion of Brennan's file that Vickers had requested from DRDC 3 days ago. The portion that wasn't in the standard transfer package. The portion that a research director named Dr. Elspeth Carriere had faxed to Vickers' office with a handwritten note attached that said, simply, watch what she does before you decide what she is. The first 3 shooters went through their positions without incident. Standard groupings, minor wind corrections, 1 follow-up shot from Corporal Dias that Vickers marked as acceptable given the gust that had moved through at the critical moment. Good work. Solid, professional, unremarkable. Brennan was 7th in the rotation. She moved to the line without hurrying, set up her position in what Vickers recognized, even from the observation post, as a technically correct prone setup, though the operators watching from the shade structure to the left clearly found something about it worth commenting on, because there was another murmur, lower this time, accompanied by a gesture from a sergeant named Hollowell that Vickers couldn't quite interpret but didn't like. He watched her through the spotting scope. She wasn't shooting yet. She was doing something with a small notebook, not unusual. Many shooters kept dope books, but the way she was working through whatever was on the page looked less like consulting established data and more like active calculation. Small, precise pencil marks. A pause. More marks. Wieland materialized at his elbow. She's stalling. She's working. For a 400-meter wind flag at 800 meters, there's nothing to work. You apply the standard correction, and you shoot. Vickers didn't answer. What he was observing, though he didn't have the vocabulary to name it in the way that Brennan would have, was something more specific than standard wind correction. The flag at 400 meters was showing 12 kilometers per hour, but there was a second flag, a temporary one that the range safety officer had planted at 650 meters for an earlier exercise and hadn't yet retrieved, and it was showing something slightly different. A variance in the lower level airflow, a vertical gradient that a standard correction calculation would have missed entirely because standard correction calculations weren't designed to account for it. Brennan had noticed it. She was accounting for it. She fired once. The target indicator at 800 meters registered a hit. Center mass. Not slightly off center. Not acceptable for conditions. Center. There was a pause from the shade structure. Not silence. The shift from murmuring to actual silence was a distinct thing, and Vickers had heard it enough times to know what it meant. It meant that a group of people who had arrived at a conclusion were now encountering data that didn't support it. Hollowell, to his credit, said nothing for a full 15 seconds. Then, wind shifted. "Flag's been steady for 4 minutes, said the range officer without looking up. Another pause. Brennan had already begun clearing her position. She didn't look toward the observation post, didn't look toward the shade structure. She wrote something in the notebook and closed it. The trouble started that afternoon, and it started with paperwork. Not dramatic trouble. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that accumulates quietly in administrative channels. A scoring form submitted with an error in the atmospheric conditions field, which caused Brennan's morning result to be flagged for review rather than logged as complete. A request for her equipment inspection records that turned out to have been filed under the wrong identifier. A scheduling note that placed her in a classroom orientation session during the afternoon's practical component, which she only discovered when she arrived at the range and found her position occupied. Brennan stood at the edge of the range for a moment. Wieland was 20 meters away, working through something on a tablet. Master Corporal. He looked up. Specialist. There's been a scheduling conflict. I've been listed for the orientation session. I'm aware. The orientation session is for incoming administrative personnel. I'm not administrative personnel. Wieland's expression was neutral in a way that required some effort to maintain. The schedule is what it is. If you have concerns, you can raise them through your chain of command. My chain of command is Sergeant Major Vickers. Then I'd suggest you speak with him. She did. Vickers listened to the situation, reviewed the paperwork, and identified the error within 4 minutes. He corrected it, sent Brennan back to the range, and then went to find Wieland. He didn't raise his voice. He had learned some years ago that raising his voice produced resentment in the person receiving it and a performance of compliance that mimicked the real thing closely enough to be difficult to distinguish. He spoke quietly and specifically instead about the standards he expected and about the professional conduct he considered non-negotiable, and he said, once, at the end, "This doesn't happen again." Wieland said yes, sir, in the tone that meant he understood and agreed with the technical content of the instruction. And Vickers was realistic enough to know that the feeling underneath that agreement might be a more complicated thing. He was right to be realistic. Because what happened with the paperwork was the visible portion. The portion Vickers could identify and address. What he couldn't as easily address was what was happening in the smaller moments, in the way certain briefings got delivered after Brennan had left the room, in the way certain pieces of range knowledge circulated without reaching her, in the particular tone that Hollowell used when explaining protocol to other members of the cadre versus the tone he used when explaining it to her. None of it was demonstrable. All of it was real. Brennan noticed it. Of course she noticed it. She was a mathematician. She was trained to identify patterns in incomplete data. She noticed the gap in information, triangulated what it implied, and adjusted her approach accordingly, which meant, in practical terms, that she began arriving earlier than scheduled, spending more time with the primary documentation, and asking specific questions of the range safety officer who had no reason to be adversarial and therefore wasn't. She didn't raise the issue with Vickers. She filed it away and continued working. This was the part that the operators watching her couldn't see and wouldn't have understood if they could. The decision to absorb rather than escalate wasn't passivity. It was arithmetic. She was calculating the cost of each possible response and selecting the one with the best outcome to risk ratio. Confrontation would produce defensiveness and make the informal information blockade more deliberate and harder to navigate. Withdrawal would confirm the assumption that she couldn't manage operational pressure. Continued competent performance, combined with patience and the strategic use of accessible channels, was the only approach that produced a net positive result. She didn't find it pleasant, but she found it logical. The night before the culminating exercise, Audra sat in the equipment room alone and worked through the ballistics table for the next day's scenario. The scenario was this: a moving target at variable distances, between 600 and 1100 meters, under conditions that would be determined on the morning of the exercise. Wind, temperature, humidity, and elevation data would be provided 30 minutes before the shoot. Each operator would have one round. This was not standard. Standard training exercises built in correction opportunities. But JTF2 operational reality didn't always offer correction opportunities, and so the culminating exercise was designed to mirror that reality. One round, one result. The other operators were not in the equipment room. Most of them were in the mess, winding down in the way that people who had done this many times wind down, with a particular kind of casual familiarity that comes from having survived enough difficult things to trust that you'll survive the next one. Audra didn't share that familiarity. She had the calculations, and she had what she knew about her own preparation, and she had the table in front of her. She worked through it methodically. The problem with a moving target at variable range was that the variables didn't compound linearly. They compounded geometrically, each interacting with the others in ways that standard linear correction models didn't capture. The model she had developed at DRDC accounted for the interaction terms. She had never used it in a live scenario, only in controlled range tests and simulation environments. She knew it worked. She also knew that knowing something works in a simulation and knowing it works when your hands are the ones on the rifle are different kinds of knowing. She sat with that for a while. At some point, she wasn't tracking time carefully. The door opened and a woman came in. One of the range safety officers, a warrant officer named Kildare, who had spoken to her on 3 separate occasions about equipment protocols, and had done so without any of the ambient hostility that characterized most of her interactions here. Kildare looked at the table. "How long have you been at that?" "A few hours." Kildare pulled up a stool. "You want company or do you want quiet?" Audra considered. Either is fine. Kildare didn't offer encouragement and didn't offer advice. She sat for 20 minutes, reading something on her phone, and the presence of another person in the room made the work feel slightly less like something done in opposition to the world and slightly more like something done alongside it. When Kildare left, she said, "Get some sleep before midnight. Whatever you've got in that table either works or it doesn't. Looking at it another 3 hours won't change that." Audra looked at the table. Then she closed the notebook. The morning came in gray and cold, the kind of flat Canadian October morning that gives you nothing to read and nothing to push against. Just a neutral, indifferent sky pressing down on ground that has hardened overnight. 30 minutes before the exercise, the conditions package arrived. Wind, 14 kilometers per hour from the northwest, with a forecast shift to west-northwest at approximately the time the shoot would begin. Temperature, 8 degrees. Humidity, 63%. Elevation, standard for the range. Target movement, 3 to 4 kilometers per hour, left to right. Distance varying between 700 and 1,000 meters. The operators gathered around the conditions sheet. There was a moment of collective recalibration, the kind of internal adjustment that experienced shooters make without making a production of it, updating mental models and committing to a plan. Audra worked through her model. The forecasted wind shift was the complicating factor. It hadn't materialized yet, but if it came in during the shoot, a standard left-to-right moving target calculation would require adjustment mid-approach. Not impossible, but requiring pre-calculation of the adjustment rather than real-time improvisation, because at the moment of decision there would be no time for improvisation. She wrote 3 numbers in her notebook and circled them. Hollowell was 3 positions down. She heard him say something to Dias, not loudly but not quietly enough to be inaudible, about civilian contractors and qualification exercises and the gap between mathematical theory and practical reality. Dias didn't respond, which Audra noted without looking up. Vickers arrived at ZO 840 and walked the line without speaking. He stopped behind Audra's position for slightly longer than he stopped behind anyone else's, then moved on. The exercise began. The first 4 operators went in order. Vickers watched their results without visible reaction, though his jaw tightened on the 3rd miss, which was a result of a shooter failing to account for target acceleration at the 600-meter threshold. Hollowell went 5th. His result was a hit. Clean, confident, well executed. He was a good shooter, genuinely good, and the satisfaction he showed afterward was earned. He caught Vickers' eye and didn't quite allow himself to look toward Brennan's position, which told Vickers a number of things. Brennan went 7th again. She had requested the 7th position. Vickers had noted this without asking why, and he had noted it again when he looked at the conditions package and recognized that the forecasted wind shift, if it arrived on schedule, would arrive during the 7th or 8th slot. Audra settled into position and did not hurry. She had 3 numbers. The first was her base correction for the target's current heading and speed at 700 meters. The second was the adjusted correction if the target moved toward the far end of its range before the wind shift. The third was the modified value that accounted for the shift itself, a lateral value that would feel, to anyone watching from outside, like an overcorrection. The target began its traversal. She tracked. The crosswind was holding, 14 kilometers per hour, steady. The target was moving left to right at the low end of the range, approximately 720 meters. She breathed and waited. There. At the 750-meter threshold, the target began its drift toward the far end. The wind was doing something different at the flag now. She couldn't see the far flag from her position, but she had calculated when the shift would arrive, and she trusted the calculation. She felt the shift before she saw evidence of it. A slight change in the way the air moved at ground level. The tall grass on the range perimeter tilted marginally to the right. She adjusted to the 3rd number. She fired. The range was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the morning itself was waiting for the target indicator. It registered, center. The quiet lasted longer this time, long enough that Vickers, standing at the observation post, became aware of it as a distinct phenomenon, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something that was working itself out in real time among the people on the line. A recalibration, the same kind that experienced operators make when new data doesn't fit the existing model, except that this one was about a person rather than a wind variable. Hollowell was looking at the target indicator. He looked at it for several seconds. Then he looked at the conditions sheet, presumably checking the wind data at the time of the shot. He didn't say anything. Vickers made a note on his clipboard and did not permit himself any visible expression. The debrief was standard. Vickers worked through each result chronologically, noted corrections for the shooters who had missed, acknowledged the hits without ceremony. When he reached the 7th result, he paused the same amount of time he paused for each of the others and said, "Clean shot, appropriate adjustment for the shift, good preparation." He did not add anything further, and he did not look toward Hollowell. Afterward, as the cadre cleared out, Wieland lingered. Vickers waited. "The wind shift," Wieland said finally. "What about it?" "She pre-calculated it." "Yes. How?" Vickers considered the question carefully. She read the data she had access to, and she modeled the interaction terms. It's what she was hired to do. Wieland was quiet for a moment. "The DRDC file. The portion you requested." "Yes." "What was in it?" Vickers picked up his clipboard. 1,100 hours of controlled range work. performance data across 47 atmospheric scenarios, and a note from the research director that said she'd never once needed to be told something twice. He left Wheeland with that and walked back to the range, which was empty now except for the range safety officer resetting the target markers and Warrant Officer Kildare checking equipment at the storage bay. He found Brennan's notebook on the bench where she'd left it. She hadn't taken it with her. He looked at it for a moment without opening it. Then he picked it up and walked to find her. She was at the edge of the range, where the tree line started, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the thin October light, looking out at the distance markers still standing in the field. He held out the notebook. She took it without comment. "Tomorrow's rotation," he said. "You'll be running the wind analysis for the cadre, not just your own position, the full line." She looked at him. "All of them?" "All of them." It wasn't a reward. It wasn't a concession. It was a straightforward operational decision based on available evidence, and they both understood it as such. "Yes, sir," she said. Vickers walked back toward the administration building. Behind him, he heard nothing. No reaction, no release of breath, no sound that indicated anything particular. Just the wind moving over the flat ground of the range, carrying a few dried leaves from the tree line across the frozen grass and the faint mechanical sound of the target markers being reset for tomorrow. Audra stood at the edge of the field until the range officer finished and left, and the space was quiet. She had come here not knowing whether the model would hold. She had come here from a controlled environment into an uncontrolled one, from a place where variables were managed into a place where they arrived without warning and required immediate response. She had come here without allies and without advocates, into a unit that had decided what she was before she had spoken a single word. The model had held. She opened the notebook and looked at the 3 circled numbers. Then she looked at the distance markers, still and vertical in the fading afternoon, each one standing at exactly the distance marked, exactly where it had always been. She closed the notebook. The wind had shifted back to northwest again, and the afternoon was getting cold, and tomorrow the rotation would begin at 7:30, and she had work to do. She turned and walked back toward the barracks, and the field behind her was empty and quiet, and the target markers stood in the fading light, and the numbers in her notebook were still correct, and they would be correct tomorrow as well. That was all she needed to know.